charts?
I haven't checked yet. I did not.
We're ready to go. Whenever you are, boss.
All right, we're gonna roll here so we get going.
Maybe.
The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to review the critical infrastructure, technology, and personnel funding needed by U.S. Customs and Border Protection to enhance our nation's border security. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. All three branches of the government are now engaged in an attempt to resolve an issue created by the unconstitutional actions of the previous administration. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, provides legal status for those brought to the United States as minors by executive action. Impending legal action by the states pushed President Trump to announce the termination of the program last year with a 6-month delay. And absent recent court rulings, it would have officially ended last week. For months, many of us in Congress have been working diligently on a lawful solution for the DACA population. However, any solution reached must ensure that, as a nation of laws, we will not repeat the mistakes of the past and end up in the same place, discussing this very same issue about the next similar population in 10, 15, or 5 years down the road. Border security is a critical pillar of that solution, and it's a key part of the compromise proposal offered by President Trump. As the debate rages on in the media, here in Congress, and especially on this subcommittee, it's our responsibility to fully examine what it will take, both in terms of policy changes and dollars and cents to secure our nation's border. To be clear, the federal government's responsibility is to secure our borders, and that's independent from any way forward on DACA. And in addition to being the chair of this subcommittee, I'm one of 9 members of Congress that actually represent a border district. And my constituents have waited too long for Washington, D.C. to provide all the resources, the strategy, and the manpower that will be required to secure the border and stop the cartel activity tracking through our communities. It's refreshing to have a president who has the will to do what it takes to provide real border security. Today, we're here to talk about what resources are needed and how they will be deployed to get the mission done. Late last year, in the context of the DACA-related negotiations, we asked U.S. Customs and Border Protection leadership to provide Congress with a list of what they needed to adequately secure the border. They responded in early January by delivering a document entitled Critical CBP Requirements to Improve Border Security. This document details major border security investments across 4 main categories: physical barriers, technology, access, and additional staffing. In total, this proposal calls for an expenditure of more than $33 billion over the next 10 fiscal years. This is not an insignificant sum of money for an organization whose annual budget is almost $17 billion. This request proposes to construct hundreds of miles of new barriers, deploy billions of dollars of new technology, and hire thousands of new agents and officers based on requirements generated from CBP field commanders. For years, CBP has reiterated the need for the right combination of barriers, technology, and personnel. The reason is simple. The border's complex. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Along the 1,954 miles of border, there are wide variations in terrain and threats, from urban cores like San Diego and El Paso to remote rural areas like in my district in Arizona. CBP has put forth a series of proposals to achieve situational awareness and operational control. Most members of Congress say they're committed to securing the border, and if that's the case, we have an obligation to carefully and thoughtfully consider what CBP has requested to get the job done. I would encourage members of the subcommittee to listen to the justifications for these expenditures given by career professionals, like Deputy Commissioner Vitello and Agent Brandon Judd on the next panel, who have worked the border and know firsthand the challenges that we are up against. We know that the border is not secure. Gangs and trafficking organizations exploit it every day. And it's not just border communities who are threatened by these bad actors. Americans across the country, including those being impacted by the opioid epidemic, are affected by the illicit activities traversing our borders. We've got a unique opportunity here to change the status quo on the border. The proposals offered by CBP start as a solid framework. I want to be clear. Real border security is more than just a border wall system, technology, and personnel. It also includes aspects of policy. Ensuring that illicit border crossers are promptly removed from the country discourages others from illegally crossing in the future and sends the message our nation's laws will be enforced. And unfortunately, there are too many loopholes right now in our current system that are used on a daily basis by the cartels to thwart the hard work done by the men and women of CBP and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. These loopholes also must be closed. Over the last 6 months, I have collaborated with Chairman McCall, Chairman Goodlatte, and Representative Labrador to craft legislation that closes these loopholes and authorizes this critical funding for border security into a trust fund and ensure the mission is complete and future Congresses can't halt the progress. Our bill, called the Secure America's Future Act, includes other important provisions to end chain migration, the visa lottery, crack down on sanctuary cities, Kate's Law, and a bill I previously introduced to go after cartel scouts who sit on hilltops and direct cartel activity, often with better equipment than our agents. It also provides a pathway forward for DACA recipients. We're working to bring our bill to the floor of the House for a vote. I've called today's hearing because I want to dive into the details of the CBP request on border security and help the American people understand what the border security return on investment could be, what would be realized if this strategy is fully funded. Agents and officers of CBP work every single day to secure our nation, often in rugged terrain, dangerous situations, and in very remote areas far away from the amenities of modern life. We owe it to them to give them the tools and the resources that support their ability to gain and maintain situational awareness and operational control of our border. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today, and I now recognize Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vela, for a statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman McSally, and thank you to our witnesses who have joined us this afternoon. Today, we examine the Department's Border Security Improvement Plan and discuss other policy changes proposed by DHS to deter illegal migration. The intention for this plan was to provide Congress with a substantive analysis of alternatives and life cycle costs for needed border security investments over the next decade. Unfortunately, this is not what we received in January. The way I see it, this Border Security Improvement Plan illustrates how the Trump administration has politicized the way we identify border security gaps. Of the $33 billion in investments identified in this plan, approximately 55% of these taxpayer dollars are meant to build a big, beautiful border wall. That seems unusually disproportionate given what we have heard in testimony from the Coast Guard and CBP's own frontline personnel over the course of this Congress. For example, there is no mention of funding to fix CBP's Office of Field Operations staffing shortage, a long-standing and well-known problem that requires CBP to hire more than 3,500 additional officers. Under this plan, it would seem that CBP officers across this country, including those from my district and the Chairwoman's, will continue to work 16-hour shifts, be temporarily reassigned to different field offices, or do both in order to make up for the lack of officers. These CBP staffing issues are critical to border security, yet the administration continues to ignore these problems. The President was in San Diego this past Tuesday to view the border wall prototypes, but he chose not to visit San Ysidro or Otay Mesa ports of entry to get a sense of the volume of cargo and people our officers have to vet and screen daily. Rather, the administration is seeking to nearly double the number of miles of barriers along the U.S.-Mexico border between ports of entry. Under this plan, my district in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas would see a significant amount of construction, including in environmentally sensitive locations like the Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. My staff has made repeated requests for the data showing the number of apprehensions and risk level in this location, and we're still waiting to be briefed by CBP on what has made the Wildlife Refuge its first priority for building a levee wall. Despite the lessons from 10 years ago, this plan does not provide estimates of the full cost, time, and resources that will be required to take land from private landowners to build this border wall. The $18 billion estimated by the Department will most likely skyrocket over time, just as costs did during the previous border fence construction due to eminent domain. Even more surprising is the lack of metrics. In a series of reports released last year, GAO found that while CBP collects a lot of data, they have no metrics in place to accurately assess the return on our previous investments in technology and border barriers. CBP may not have these metrics in place until September 2019. And yet here we are, actively discussing the $33 billion plan without a sense of which tools have been most useful in securing our borders. However, a report issued by DHS in September 2017 found that our southern land border is more difficult to cross today than ever before. This report also found that we are seeing the lowest number of illegal entries in the past 40 years. Given these findings, DHS's Border Security Improvement Plan seems like a retroactive justification for pursuing a campaign promise instead of a plan based on a strategy to address known needs at our ports of entry or along our northern border or our coastlines. Lastly, I wish to acknowledge Mr. Tony Reardon and Mr. Brandon Judd for joining us a second time in a row to testify. Based on our hearing this past January, I introduced the Border and Port Security Act to start addressing the dire staffing shortages within CBP's Office of Field Operations. Significant changes to CBP's hiring process and retention policies are needed, but in the meantime, we can at least begin by authorizing CBP to meet the requirements identified in its workload staffing models. Again, I thank all of our witnesses for joining us this afternoon, and I am eager to hear your views on the administration's proposed approach to border security improvements. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members of the committee are reminded opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have two distinguished panels of witnesses before us today to discuss this important topic. We'll first hear from Ms. Claire Grady, who is the Undersecretary for Management at Department of Homeland Security. In this role, she is third in command of the department and oversees a budget of $60 billion and a workforce of 240,000 dedicated Homeland Security professionals. Mr. Ron Vitello is the Acting Deputy Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. Previously, he served as the Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. As its Chief Operating Officer, he was responsible for the daily operations of the U.S. Border Patrol, assisting in planning and directing nationwide enforcement and administrative operations. Ms. Rebecca Gambler is a Director in the U.S. Government Accountability Office's Homeland Security and Justice Team, where she leads GAO's work on border security, immigration, and the Department of Homeland Security's management and transformation. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The Chair now recognizes Undersecretary Grady for 5 minutes to testify.
Thank you, Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Villa, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify today. It is an honor to appear before you and to engage in this important discussion. As DHS's Undersecretary for Management, I am responsible for the lines of business that enable the department's mission with a focus on integrating and unifying the third largest department in the federal government. I oversee all aspects of the department's management programs in support of Homeland Security operations, including financial management, human capital, information technology, acquisition, security, logistics, and asset management. As the Chief Acquisition Officer for DHS, I am ultimately responsible for the department's acquisition and procurement programs. Through the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, the Program Accountability and Risk Management Office, and other DHS functional leads, I provide policy, oversight, and management of these programs. Initially, the department was comprised of disparate components with different approaches, methods, and policies regarding acquisition and management activities. The absence of a departmental acquisition oversight structure, a strong requirements development process, and centralized resource allocation created challenges. We lacked a unified departmental approach for the administration of the department's management and acquisition efforts that are critical to the security of our nation. During the past several years, DHS has made significant progress to strengthen and improve its requirements, budgeting, and acquisition processes. DHS has focused on institutionalizing robust oversight and governance structures and maturing the acquisition process to build upon solid requirements analysis, ensuring operators are engaged in determining capability caps and mission needs. The planned new investments for border security will benefit from this maturation of processes and development of expertise, ensuring we deliver the right capability on time and within budget. The border wall and associated technology are being managed in accordance with Directives 107-1, Joint Requirements, and 102-1, Acquisition Management. By delivering the wall system in prioritized segments, CBP has established a sound acquisition strategy that mitigates risk and delivers capability that is sequenced based on operators' needs. In concert with CBP, we have instituted an executive steering committee in which leadership and senior functional experts, including the Chief Procurement Officer and the Chief Financial Officer, participate with a focus on effectively and efficiently delivering this much-needed capability. For all large dollar investments, I personally review and approve required program documentation and chair and make decisions on readiness to proceed at acquisition review boards. We are leveraging the full capability of the department to position this critical effort for success. In addition to infrastructure and technology, frontline and support personnel are critical to border security. We must have sufficiently trained, experienced, and equipped Border Patrol agents to perform the important and often dangerous work of securing our borders. As the Undersecretary for Management, I am committed to providing the necessary oversight and resources to ensure CBP can and will successfully perform its mission. As you may know, the executive order on border security and immigration enforcement mandated the hiring of 5,000 additional Border Patrol agents. To implement this, we continue to explore all avenues to meet current and future human capital needs with high-quality, ethical individuals who are committed to the rule of law and protecting our nation. We continually analyze and refine recruitment and hiring practices to secure adequate staffing for critical frontline and support personnel. Our focus is on attracting more applicants who are suited to the unique demands of CBP's mission, expediting the pre-employment timeline, and reducing the attrition rate of the existing workforce. While there is always much more work to do, the department has made significant strides to improve management, including acquisition planning and execution. With continued and frequent engagement between CBP leadership and the department, DHS will deliver maximum value for taxpayer dollars invested in border security. This open communication and assistance from the department, coupled with a measured approval by segment strategy, ensures delivery of operational capability that will improve the security of our homeland. We are committed to employing the combination of infrastructure, technology, and Border Patrol agents that most effectively and economically secures the borders, increasing our national security and promoting American economic interests. Chairman McSally, Ranking Member Vea, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Undersecretary Grady. The chair now recognizes Deputy Commissioner Vitello for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vela, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss how U.S. Customs and Border Protection uses the right mix of technology, infrastructure, and personnel to achieve our strategic and operational border security objectives. Barriers, roads, gates, lights, sensors, enforcement cameras, other related systems all contribute to CBP's work to prevent terrorists and terrorist weapons, illegal aliens, smugglers, narcotics, and other contraband from crossing U.S. borders. I started my career with the United States Border Patrol over 30 years ago and have seen firsthand how border barriers enhance operational capabilities. Border barriers create an enduring capability that impedes, deters, and prevents illegal entries. Technology and access roads enhance situational awareness and enable agents and officers to respond to changing threats quickly and effectively. CBP plans to deploy border wall system in a multi-phased approach that meets the U.S. Border Patrol's operational requirements, safeguards the national security and public safety, and is the result of thorough analysis of threat and mission effectiveness. CBP is committed to ensuring that all stakeholder communities are informed throughout the process. CBP deploys proven effective technology at and between our ports of entry. Technology is an invaluable force multiplier that increases situational awareness, reduces safety risks for our frontline personnel. Persistent surveillance technologies enable Border Patrol to remotely detect, identify, classify, and track items of interest. Mobile technologies give Border Patrol the flexibility to adapt to changing border conditions and threats. CBP's air and marine operations increases CBP's situational awareness, enhances our detection and interdiction capabilities, and extends our border security zones. AMO's assets, including aircraft, coastal interceptor vessels, and sophisticated downlink technology, provide multi-domain awareness for our partners across DHS. AMO also provides critical aerial and maritime surveillance, interdiction, and operational assistance to ground personnel. CBP continues to strengthen our hiring capabilities to reach our staffing goals. CBP's use of advanced data analytics have resulted in an overall increase in applicants, lowered the number of applicants it takes to onboard an officer or an agent, and reduced the time to hire. In the last 12 months, close to 70% of new Border Patrol agents and 60% of new CBP officers onboarded in 313 days or fewer, with 13% of each occupation onboarding within 160 days. This is a significant improvement from January 2016, when it took 469 days. In addition, our large-scale but focused marketing efforts have increased not only the quality and quantity of frontline applicants. CBP saw a 42% increase in applicants between FY16 and 17, but also the quality of these applicants as we continue to identify individuals who are more likely to succeed through the process. In FY16, CBP needed 179 applicants to onboard one agent or officer. In FY17, these numbers are down to 74 and 42 applicants, respectively. As we continue to build on our many advancements over the last 2 years, we are optimistic that positive trends will continue and that our efforts will not only enable us to reach our hiring targets, but ensure that CBP can always adapt effectively to a growing and increasingly complex mission. With the support of Congress, CBP will continue to secure our nation's border through the risk-based deployment of infrastructure, personnel, and technology. Each of these investments strengthens the capability CBP needs to achieve operational control of the border. I would be remiss if I did not mention the officers and agents on the front line. Many of you have been to visit them and seen in the field and seen what good they do. The border environment is at times challenging. Despite that, the men and women of CBP are undaunted in their pursuit of securing borders. They protect our nation as law enforcers in many situations and serve as selfless humanitarians. I pray that my representation of them is as worthy as the service that they and their families give to this great nation. Thank you for having me as a witness today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chief. Deputy Commissioner Vitello. The chair now recognizes Ms. Gambler for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Vella, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify at today's hearing to discuss GAO's work on the Department of Homeland Security's efforts to deploy surveillance technologies, physical barriers, and personnel along the southwest border. Over the years, GAO has issued dozens of reports addressing these areas, and today I'm going to highlight our key findings and recommendations. First, as it relates to the deployment of surveillance technologies, DHS has made progress. As of November 2017, DHS had completed deployment of selected technologies to areas in Arizona, Texas, and California. These technologies include fixed and mobile assets with cameras and radars. For example, DHS reported deploying all planned remote video surveillance systems and mobile surveillance capability systems to Arizona. DHS also deployed 15 of 53 integrated fixed tower systems to Arizona as of November 2017, and DHS deployed all planned mobile surveillance capability systems to Texas and California. Regarding physical barriers, from fiscal years 2007 through 2015, DHS spent approximately $2.4 billion on tactical infrastructure on the southwest border, which includes fencing, roads, lighting, and other assets. About 95% of that amount was spent on constructing pedestrian and vehicle fencing or barriers. There is about 654 miles of primary pedestrian and vehicle fencing along the southwest border, and some areas of the border also have second and third layers of fencing. These deployments of surveillance technologies and physical barriers have benefited border security operations. Reported benefits from technology and barriers include better situational awareness, improved agent safety, and reduced vehicle incursions, among others. However, despite these benefits, DHS has not established metrics for assessing its investments in surveillance technologies and physical barriers. DHS collects data that it could use to help make such assessments, including data on illegal entries, apprehensions, seizures, and asset assists. We have reported that with regard to fencing, for example, DHS could use these data to compare the occurrence and location of illegal entries before and after construction. DHS could also use these data to help determine the extent to which barriers contribute to diverting illegal entrants into more rural and remote environments and their impact, if any, on apprehension rates over time. We have made recommendations to DHS to establish metrics and use available data to assess the contributions of surveillance technologies and barriers to border security operations. These metrics and data can be helpful to DHS in informing future investment and resource decisions. To its credit, DHS has agreed with these recommendations and is taking action toward addressing them. And we are continuing to monitor DHS's progress in addressing these and other recommendations related to strengthening the department's management, oversight, and planning for border security programs. In that vein, we have ongoing work reviewing DHS's planning efforts for a border wall system. DHS has procured and tested 8 barrier prototypes, and we are currently evaluating how DHS conducted and is using those prototypes and tests. We plan to report on the results of our work later this year. Turning to personnel resources, we also have ongoing work for this subcommittee reviewing CBP's efforts to recruit, hire, and retain law enforcement personnel. And we also expect to report on the results of this work later this year. Our prior work on Border Patrol deployment strategy has identified staffing challenges for the agency. In particular, Border Patrol has faced challenges in staffing to its authorized levels, and in recent years, Border Patrol has, on average, lost more agents than it has hired. CBP has identified challenges faced in hiring efforts such as duty locations, compensation, and competition with other law enforcement agencies. These staffing challenges can affect the Border Patrol's deployment strategy. Through our prior work, we found that officials from all 9 Southwest Border Patrol sectors cited current staffing levels and the availability of agents as a challenge for optimal deployment. In closing, our work has identified both progress and challenges in DHS's efforts to deploy and manage technologies, physical barriers, and personnel to secure the Southwest border. We have also identified opportunities for DHS to strengthen its border security programs and efforts and better assess the contributions of its investments to overall border security. We will continue to monitor DHS's efforts in these areas. This completes my prepared statement, and I'm happy to answer any questions members may have.
Thank you, Ms. Gamble. I appreciate it. And I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, first round. Undersecretary Grady. So the request that we got that I referenced in our opening document was for $33 billion in the context, again, of the DACA discussion, and we appreciate the $33 billion and the breakdown of that. But there was also some numbers that have been thrown out within the White House framework of $25 billion requested for border security, and some of that also calls for additional funding for ports of entry and exit. We, in our bill, have created a trust fund for $38 billion, trying to take into account all of these things to include additional agents at the ports of entry and technology at the ports of entry and everything that we really believe is needed. Can you just explain the difference of the numbers? Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Is it 25? Is it 33? Is it 38? Because we think it's 38, so we just want to be clear.
Absolutely, Chairwoman. And there's actually more consistency to the numbers than it may appear. The big differences between those numbers are timeframes in terms of duration, as well as whether you included operation and support costs and personnel costs. So that is probably the most fundamental difference in terms of whether the costs of hiring the additional necessary Border Patrol agents are included or not included. Throughout all of those numbers, what is consistent is the border wall number, looking at $18 billion, and then there's technology, infrastructure, and do you or don't you include the numbers associated with the Border Patrol agents? Throughout all of these, we consider it very necessary to increase the number of Border Patrol agents. It's whether it's included in that number that may become part of a trust fund or not is been the difference. And one of the things that we think it's very important to inform the discussion is what is more of a one-time cost with some sustainment versus a recurring cost, which your Border Patrol agent salaries would be a recurring cost that we would have to make sure gets assumed in the base budget to continue that effort. So that's the fundamental difference between those 3 numbers that you just listed.
Okay, so just for our bill that I talked about at the beginning, just to be clear, it includes the resources for the border wall system, plus the access roads, plus 5,000 Border Patrol agents, plus 5,000 CBP officers for the ports of entry, plus the additional resources for biometric entry-exit and the non-detected intrusion for the ports of entry. So we include all that for $38 billion.
Correct.
Is that going to be, over the next 10 years, enough for us to address this issue?
Based on the estimates that we've developed, consistent with the requirements that the Border Patrol has developed based on operational needs, that aligns with numbers that we're looking for. But I do want to make it clear that the Border Patrol agent salaries, as well as sustainment of those capabilities, would be recurring bills beyond that, that time.
Of course, yep. Thank you. Deputy Commissioner Vitello, so the border wall system, this is, one that it gets a lot of attention, especially across the media, and somehow has become somewhat polarized, which I don't quite understand. Having been in my district just recently down in Naco and looking at where there's replacement fencing, that was all approved under the previous administration, as you know. Lots of miles of replacement fencing and some additional barriers, wall barriers approved under previous administrations. So this has been a consistent element of what the operators have asked for, where appropriate, in order to do impedance and denial. So in this request for the $18 billion, it's about 722 miles. Could you kind of break that down for everybody and why the operators say that they need that as a part of a system that's going to actually secure the border?
Thanks for that question. As you recall, as you mentioned, it was previously authorized in the Secure Fence Act for a number of miles on the southwest border, and it raised the standard in the law for operational control. That's a very high bar as it relates to what Border Patrol agents are required to do in between the ports of entry at the immediate border. So to meet that standard, we went to the field, we put them through a framework, we asked them what problems that they have. We looked at the activity levels that they currently face. We looked at how active it is, what's within the threats of the arrests that they are making. We looked at suitability for impedance and denial, and we looked at whether we can construct in certain locations, because there are some terrain features that it's not conducive to building or constructing. So those are all of the elements that we considered and asked the operators where they needed additional barriers. And we're not just asking for impedance and denial. That's important enough. The barrier makes a difference, but we're asking for that situational awareness piece. That's part of this request. So that's the cameras, that's the sensors, that's the lights. And then we're also asking for access and mobility. We're looking for a rapid way to get to the border and lateral access while you're there, and an area to patrol safely and in a convenient way. So access and mobility, impedance and denial, mission readiness, the additional hiring, having the agents on the ground, because it's vital for us to be successful, for them to be able to make those arrests. So those are all of the things we're asking for. We're not just asking for a barrier. We're asking for that combination of things that makes the border safer.
Great, thanks. One last quick question for this round. So there is concern, obviously, it's a significant amount of resources, that DHS is actually spending resources wisely and is making, being good stewards of what we would provide to them, should we be able to get this signed into law. I am concerned about this contract with a company to go out and recruit. It's great to see that the number of days have gone down, but nobody can wait 10 months still to get a job. So that needs to go, to be shorter while you're still vetting people. But our major issue right now, both with the Border Patrol and at the ports of entry, is retention. You've got these highly trained and capable people that they're working very hard under very difficult conditions, and they're leaving faster than we're gaining them. So isn't it better to invest those resources into retention programs right now to stop the bleeding as opposed to focusing on the recruiting?
So from our perspective, we need to invest in both. We need to retain the high-quality individuals that are trained and at their full performance level, as well as continue to have and bring in and recruit new talent. So we've asked for a balance of the two, both in terms of recruiting efforts and retention and relocation incentives to use with our existing workforce. And I don't know if the chief has anything he wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would just add that all three of those elements are required. We've done a number of things, both on the OFO side and CBP officers and with Border Patrol. I think the most important thing that's has been developed and is in practice now is the relocation program, where we sat with the union officials and agreed on a way forward that allows journeyman agents to move as journeyman agents to other parts of the border. We did the human capital study. You all have heard about the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. We looked deep into those numbers and found out that relocation is a driver for people who are leaving the organization. So we put a program together with your all's help, with appropriate funding to be able to move a certain percentage of the workforce each and every year. And so far, that's paying off. We're seeing increased morale scores as it relates to those numbers, and we're getting a lot of good comments from the workforce about their ability to go somewhere else and do their work in other locations.
Great. I just want to note that our bill, the Secure America's Future Act, actually provides also additional incentives and resources to retain professionals, and also relocation bonuses for those who are serving in hard-to-serve areas. I think that's critically important. We do that in the military to try and help retain people with bonuses and things like that, and we should be doing that with you all as well. All right, I'm going to now yield to Ranking Member Vela.
Would you say that the $18 billion requested by the Trump administration to build border walls over the next 10 years is an accurate cost estimate?
So at a high level, that is an accurate estimate given everything that we know, and it is informed by our experience doing wall acquisition, including real estate acquisition, which you highlighted the challenges associated with that. So that all of our experience informed that estimate. As we go forward and move on with each individual segment, we're doing a far more detailed cost estimate to manage the project for the individual segments. But at the high level estimate, it is we have high confidence in the estimating accuracy of the estimate for the $18 billion for those miles.
Yeah, and I guess this next question is really one for both you and for Chief Vitello. It seems like on the issue of fulfilling our officer shortage, it seems like we're spinning wheels because we were here 3 months ago and before that several times. You know, we passed that legislation with respect to the polygraph out of the House. It's stuck there for now. But I kind of did my own investigation back home by talking to some of our local sheriff deputies and our sheriff's officers and chiefs of police. And one of the issues, the common thread in all of those discussions was that potential applicants for the Border Patrol have a very difficult time leaving their home, right? So, for example, you're familiar, Chief Vitello, with South Texas. If you've got a vacancy at the Kingsville or the Sarita checkpoint and the Valley is an hour away, it's very difficult to get those officers to move. So I'm just wondering, what exactly are we doing going forward to getting to the point where we can fulfill those shortages?
Well, that's why I highlighted in my remarks the relocation program, giving people an opportunity to go either from Kingsville back to the line or from the line to the northern border, the southern border to the northern border. So that is going to make a difference. We've already seen the buzz amongst the workforce. And then we're looking, as this program elaborates itself, we're looking at incentives for places that are harder to fill. We're looking at remote duty pay, like the chairwoman expressed that's in that legislation. We're looking at ways for us to incent employees in locations that are more difficult to be at or that we need people to apply to.
Yeah, there just seem to be simple human factors that are involved in this that broader systems may not ever really get to recognize, is what it seems to me like.
Yeah, and we try to do stuff on the retention side, those incentives of pay and the relocations and those kind of things. And then being able to target for recruits is also very important. Are beginning to understand the analytics about those who are applying and those who are being successful, and integrating that information into the materials that we use to recruit people.
Now, Secretary Grady, late last year, CBP awarded Accenture with a nearly $300 million contract to assist in recruiting additional CBP law enforcement personnel. Can you describe the role that your directorate played in the solicitation and source selection process?
Absolutely. We did review the acquisition strategy and the solicitation and resulting contract itself in terms of what CBP was looking to do, as well as having conversations. I had conversations directly with the acting commissioner about what they were pursuing. One of the challenges you heard the chief describe is the high number of applicants we get per successful entry on duty. And it's really important because it is a thorough and costly process to vet, go through medical, polygraph, and all the 12 steps associated with the process to get to a successful onboard. If we can target individuals who are more likely to be successful, it will both streamline the process and increase the cost effectiveness of being able to bring people on board. What Accenture brings to the process is the data analytics to help us target, and also some proposed business process reengineering that ideally will shorten the length of time to bring somebody on board. 303 days is great progress, but it is not a reasonable timeline and something we are targeting very hard to try and bring that down. So if there's a possibility of resequence steps, provide applicant care throughout the process, all different ideas that we're seeking to learn from the experience with Accenture. And the Accenture contract is in addition to ongoing hiring efforts we have with our federal employees and our normal HR offices. So we are hoping not just to be able to handle the surge, surge hiring, but also to learn and better improve the process and apply those best practices across both government and the use of Accenture.
Well, thank all three of you for joining us. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just like to add on the contract. You know, CBP, the department writ large, has enormous hiring challenges. Specifically for the Border Patrol, we have not yet gotten to a place where we can hire more than we're losing each and every year, and that's been that way for a couple of years. So we do have to try innovative things. I would just mention on the contract, there's a small operating cost that has been outlaid by the government so far. The $400 million or the $297 million is at the ceiling. So if if this works, Accenture has the opportunity, we have an opportunity to use the contract up to that ceiling. But if this doesn't work, if it doesn't give us the results that we're expecting to get, then we'll reinvest that potential ceiling in a different location.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Rutherford from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Vitello, the matrices that the GAO had asked about, and I think you said that you are collecting some data on, and you're seeing some improvement in the collection of data, I guess, of different areas where you can show improvement based on building a wall, bringing in technology, those kind of things. Where are you in that process exactly?
You're right that we do, and Rebecca's comments reflect that we do collect a lot of data. What we have not been able to show this body, ourselves or the public, essentially, is when we've made these investments, we've seen a noticeable improvement, right? The border community is safer, we have less activity on the border, we face less threats. But to tie those conditions, the outcomes, directly to the investments that were made is not something that we have been very good at in the past. A lot of help from oversight here, talking about situational awareness, what that means and how to measure it, and then the work that GAO does to help point out to us, tying those investments directly to. So instead of just recording the apprehension and talking about the individual's record and doing a consequence on that, we also want to be able to credit whether we used an aircraft, whether we used a drone, whether the piece of technology assisted in that application, in that apprehension. So we need to get better at that. We owe you and the public a better description of how these things contribute to overall security. So that's the work that's underway. We're trying to be methodical about it. We want to give you something that is credible, repeatable, and tells a story that is simple enough for us to explain without lots of charts and lots of graphs, but a simple assessment of what the outcomes are brought using these investments.
But and I just want to highlight the importance, I think, of that kind of data collection, because it not only shows the impact of what you're doing, but it can also be used to predict and guide you in where you need to move forces. I'm particularly talking about intelligence-led policing and how that concept of using data for deployment and then measurement of where things are going up, where things are going down, can be of great importance to you, I think, and particularly in, as you just mentioned, giving us the story of where things are good and what you need to make that story better. So I want to encourage you to continue to move on that. And then looking at the technology side, improvements at the points of entry, for example, through new iterations of VACUS or so some of the new biometrics that are coming out for scanning that can improve. When we went down and did the CODEL, and when I saw a couple of these points of entry, I'm like, oh my God, what you guys are up against is incredible. And building more lanes is obviously not the answer. Well, some of it may be, but you also have to find better ways to screen these things. And can you tell me about any hope that you have in better screening at those points of entry?
So thanks for appreciating the work that the men and women do out there. It is a task that they're well suited for. So in the context of the ports, what we've learned in CBP, one of the core competencies of CBP is targeting. So knowing what freight or what cargo or who is coming to the port as they're arriving, and having that advanced electronic information so that we can target and use selector data to say, okay, what is in this? Is this a high-risk or a low-risk shipment? And then using that data and analysis of that data to target the ones that are likely to be a problem or a threat to security. So that it starts with having that advanced information. And then you're right, in the request that's both in 18 and 19 and in the larger Border Security Improvement Plan, we talk about non-intrusive inspections investments. CBP has come to rely on these X-ray machines to do that exact, when you do target a tractor trailer and other vehicles, you can put them through that system and you have a much faster way of being able to assess those images and move the commerce, but target the bad guys as well.
Right. Thank you very much. I have some other questions, but my time has expired, so I yield back.
Yield back. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Flemings from Florida.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman McSally, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. Commissioner Vitello, is that correct? I served 27 years in law enforcement and had the honor of serving as the chief of police, and I used to think a lot about the men and women who did the job. I realized that we could have all the goals in the world, all the technology and equipment, the fancy cars, the greatest weapons, but it was truly the men and women who made the difference on the ground. Could you take just a moment to kind of talk about the men and women who work in your agency and talk about how concerned you are about their safety and how important it is?
Well, thank you for your service, and appreciate that opportunity. So it is the critical asset that CBP has. It's the men and women who get up each and every day with a heart of service to go out there and protect the border. And they face threats that come up at a moment's notice. So you think about what happens in some of these cities along the border. People are fleeing violence, that kind of thing. You think about Border Patrol agents out in the middle of nowhere, cutting sign, responding to sensors, sometimes alone. So we are concerned about their safety. That's why when they deploy, this whole mission readiness idea, that's part of what we're asking for, is to give them the right equipment, the right tools, and especially the right information so that they, as they deploy, they understand the threats that they're facing and so that they're prepared both in their mindset and then the equipment that they bring with them.
And when we've heard from several of you, or maybe all of you, about the severe staffing shortages that you have. Ms. Gambler, I believe you said that you're losing more agents than you're able to hire, and Ms. Grady, I believe you mentioned that, all of you mentioned that. As you think about the men and women who work for you and how important it is to keep them safe, could you talk a little bit about how the severe staffing shortages, not just at the border, but I would imagine all over, puts them at greater risk in terms of the job that they have to do every day?
So we do employ tools and try to automate some of the processes. You've seen some of this, like the biometric exit is an application of advanced technology that may or may not give us a chance to do the job more efficiently, both on inbound entries into the U.S. It certainly is applicable for outbound. The staffing on the OFO side, on the Customs and Border Protection officers, we're actually ahead of attrition, so we are able to hire. We do have models in CBP that suggest there are more investments required in that workforce. So we use things like automation and overtime and temporary duty staffing to address where the most critical needs for staffing are. But yeah, we are very concerned about that, and we try to use those tools to minimize the impact on the individuals.
And you've talked about streamlining your hiring process somewhat, but I believe you mentioned, Ms. Gambler, about making it more attractive, that you're competing with local and state, other law enforcement agencies. And so as we look at doing more with less, because we're all asked to do that, and what our priorities are, as we talk about $18 billion in a border wall, yet we have severe staffing shortages. Obviously, we have not taken the steps to make the jobs of the agents and officers more competitive. Would it not be a better use of the resources to make the job more attractive, more competitive, so you can continue to hire the best and brightest men and women dedicated to do that job, as opposed to putting it in spending $18 billion on another physical barrier. And I don't know which one would be more appropriate to answer that question.
I can start. I would just suggest that we need to do all of it. I know that, is kind of typical of a bureaucracy. We want to do everything, but it needs to be balanced. We need to improve conditions of security.
But
And
wouldn't your men and women be your number one priority?
they're on the list of amongst the things that we want to do, right? It's personnel, technology, and infrastructure. We want to be able to give that complete mix where it's needed most. So it's all three. And obviously, the people are the most important thing about it. They can do all three of those things, right? They can cover for the technology, they can cover for the barriers, but only the agents can make arrests and address criminal activity.
Any other?
I would,
Finish this. Please go ahead.
really quickly, if I could just add, from a good kind of capital investment acquisition management perspective, it is important for an agency as they're defining what their requirements are. So in this case, what the requirements are for border security, it is important and a leading practice to think about what the different resources are that can meet that requirement, and to think about what those alternatives are. That we're looking at the process that CBP has been going through as part of our current work, and should be able to provide some insights on that later this year. But it is an important aspect of any type of investment to think about what your requirements are and what's the right mix of things to meet that requirement.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bacon from, where are you from? Nebraska, for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
I knew that.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate what you're doing, and appreciate the folks who are working hard every day to defend our border. First question for Mr. Vitello. What is the progress for our linear ground detection system? Are we getting good results with what we're testing or what we're using?
So thanks for that question. All of the new investments in the replacement walls that are being constructed now, that we have a project ongoing in Calexico, all of the new installation will have this fiber optic cable that will be installed along with the fencing. And what that does is a number of things. It allows us to know when there's activity at the immediate border. That's a seismic sensor that cable will alert the control center where the agents get dispatched from. And it also is a way for us to recognize whether or not people could be digging near the infrastructure. So we're using it to good effect, and we hope, based on the requests that we made as we install a new wall, that'll be part of the initial laydown. Not just that, but other sensors as well, but it will be part of all new installation.
I get asked this all the time back in the district. We have about a 2,000-mile border, and we are buying a lot of these different technologies. We're trying to expand personnel. But out of that 2,000-mile border, roughly, how much wall will we really need in the end? I need to be able to articulate this better back in the district.
So there's about 654 miles of structure that are out there now. We're going to replace some of that because it's not useful anymore given its condition. So we're going to replace some of that, and effectively another almost double, a little more than double what's out there now in new installation will cover the areas of priority that have been identified by the board.
So we're looking at roughly 1,200 miles of wall, or is that too much?
It starts to get confusing because we're going to add to
some
what we have
overlapping.
now. We're going to use some secondary enforcement areas, and so, yeah, I guess if you total it all up, it would be in the 1,200 to 1,500 range.
Okay, I think if we can narrow that down, I think it makes it easier to talk to our public. There's a 2,000-mile border. We don't need it everywhere, but we want to focus it. It's actually a little more than I thought. You're giving us a little more than I thought we would need. I've been using smaller numbers.
So I have staff here that are real smart on this. So there'll be 316 miles of new pedestrian
360
fencing.
new, okay. And that's to go with the 654.
It's in addition to what's there now.
So I think that helps. I can go back. We're looking at building 360 more miles of wall out of that 2,000.
Right, and then another
And some
200
replacement.
Right, and then another 272 miles of that secondary barrier.
Okay, a secondary, got it. That's helpful. So, in the military, we also use lots of metrics when we decide what we're buying for new technology. Do you have a pretty good system for measuring metrics and when you're trying to choose between systems that you can also use for Congress, say, this is why we're picking this over that?
Yeah, so that is part of what is required in the acquisition products that are required for us to get approval to move forward in some of these projects. So we use things that I'm not well-versed in, but things like analysis of alternatives so that we're getting the best value for the investments that we make and make trade-offs for what is effective and then what will give us the outcomes we're expecting.
Okay, good. I guess that helps you sell or at least show why and convince Congress, to support those programs when you have those good metrics. So you're asking for $1.6 billion for integrated fixed towers and remote video surveillance. Will this give you a full range of video, or will you have blind spots with that?
The towers and the remote video surveillance they're in use now. So there'll be some of that will need to be refreshed and replaced, and then there'll be new additions to that capability.
Are there blind spots that you want to fill, or where the blind spots are at, you're all right?
Given the technology, there will always be areas that will have to be covered by different kinds of technology, but this deployment will help us bring that situational awareness element that's a critical capability.
One last question. I'm told that some of our communications areas along the border, there's gaps of coverage where you can't get, coverage for your communications. Are we putting things in place to help the personnel on the borders to make sure they have good comms up and down the whole border?
So the request asks for specific investments in that area as well. Okay. Yeah, that's a challenge, given the lack of infrastructure as it relates to communications backbone, the kinds of things that move signals back and forth. That's been a struggle for us for several years.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Just of note, votes will be called here in probably about 10 minutes, we think. So Chair now recognize Mr. Correa from California. We're going to then have to break for votes and come back for a second panel. Mr. Correa, you're up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I very quickly have some Ms. Scambler, if I may. As I'm listening to the conversation here, I'm thinking to myself, we have a matrix to evaluate the investments, what part of border security actually has the highest yield, and we're all talking about border security. I think there's a bigger picture here, at least from my humble perspective. I'm out of California. I've been to the San Isidro crossing. It's the crossing, it's probably, in terms of volume, people, trade, the biggest crossing in the world. And essentially, got California, Mexico. California's biggest trading partner is Mexico. Mexico is probably America's second or third largest trading partner in the world. So you have a lot of commerce, and we do need more border crossings. I was down at San Isidro a few months ago, and I was talking to some of those border agents. And when I asked them about, their job, they started telling me about these huge drug seizures that they actually had, successful in grabbing. And as I asked those agents, how did you do this? They smiled from one end to the other, saying, I've been here for 20 years. I can spot a person that's guilty just by looking at them. And then once I spot one of these individuals, I bring in the dogs, and you know what? We score big. And I'm listening to this discussion here about the wall, investments. We have taxpayers in this country. We don't have a finite amount of resources. So do we have a matrix to measure where our investments are optimal? Top of that also, some of the comments that were made a little while ago that, when you have shipments coming in, you have to get clued, so to speak, as to which shipments are legit and which shipments may not be legit. Meaning, do we have cooperation with folks in Mexico? Do we have cooperation, intel, with people from Canada? All of this put together, I'm trying to figure out, where do we get most bang for the buck? Where do I go back to my taxpayers and say, this is the most effective use of the taxpayer dollars to make sure we protect our kids from drugs? And as according to your DHS report, September 2017, the southern border is now the hardest it's ever been in terms of crossing. The number of legal entries is one of the lowest levels since the 1970s. So, common sense here would tell you that people are going to start probing the northern border, the border in the north, as well as their ports of entry. Where do we get our best bang for the buck, which comes back to, do we have essentially a metrics in place to gauge where we get our best bang for the buck?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. From the GAO perspective, that's a very important line of inquiry. Based on our work, DHS does not have metrics in place for assessing the contributions that these different investments are making to border security, and we have open recommendations to the department in that area as it relates to both, specifically to both technologies and infrastructure or barriers. I would also
So we
add,
don't know right now, based on the data we have, where the best place is to invest our taxpayer dollars to protect our citizens.
that's right, DHS does not currently
Same
have
question
metrics in place.
to Ms. Grady and Mr. Vitello.
Yes, sir. I think one of the things to differentiate is our ability to isolate the outcomes and attribute it to specific technology. We see the effects, we see the positive effects.
But you don't have a matrix to measure that yet.
To individual technologies, no, we cannot.
Not individual
Specifically
how about
attribute-
individual investments like border versus drones versus
We are working.
training personnel?
We are working to improve our data collection and the attribution, which is what the chief had talked about.
When will we have enough data to make intelligent decisions in terms of which area is best to invest our taxpayer dollars?
We are working on completing the.
When will we have that completed? Mr. Vitello?
I don't have a hard date for you, and I know that's what, in trying to prepare for that.
1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 6 years?
It's probably about a year or so out. What
But we're
we're
making decisions to invest now.
well, we do have a body of experience about what we've done already. If we could put up chart number 4, is that possible? We know over the history of CBP and the use of barriers along the border as it relates to wall and as it relates to the right mix of technology, infrastructure, and people. When we apply those investments in a strategic way along parts of the border, we know that that's going to have a beneficial outcome. We're going to reduce activity, we're going to increase safety and then the public atmosphere in those locations along the border. So we do have experience with that. We agree with GAO, and as the department is commending us to do, we're looking to give you a better history of what's happening and what has happened and which of the investments are most appropriate. But I can tell you that if you don't do all 3 of these things in simultaneous fashion, that you will not be as successful.
Madam
as
Chair,
you
I'm out of
can.
time, but I would just, that's for the southern border. We don't know about the northern border or the ports of entry.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Barragan for California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today. This week, the president visited California. It was his first trip to the state, my state. The trip to California was designed to bring attention to the president's signature issue and campaign promise, the wall. During the overnight trip, President Trump examined 8 recently constructed prototypes for a wall in San Diego near the U.S.-Mexico border. The prototypes alone cost taxpayers between $2.4 million and $4 million, in addition to the $18 billion the administration is asking us to spend. During the trip, the president said that the wall would stop, and I quote, 99% of illegal entries across the border from Mexico, and characterized those who would try to cross the border as, quote, professional mountain climbers, unquote, in his ability to scale barriers. Mr. Vitello, would a wall prevent 99% of illegal entries at the border?
Where we have the investment in a complete fashion, technology, infrastructure, mobility to the border, we will be much more effective.
But there's
in
no
that
metrics
condition.
to know it's 99%, is that correct?
We have a metric that we call the interdiction effectiveness rate, and what that does is it gives us a box score, if you will, about how many people enter and how many are caught, and where you have this infrastructure in complete fashion. When you have a barrier, when you have access to that barrier, when you have sensors that cue the response for agents, and when you have a law enforcement
I'm sorry,
response and resolution,
I have limited
you do
time,
have
and-
much higher effectiveness.
So no, nobody on this panel, is anybody else on this panel can attest to 99% will actually be, of the illegal entries are going to be prevented?
I didn't hear the quote directly, but there was a briefing that he was given by the Chief Patrol Agent in San Diego, Rodney Scott, which talked about the 99% decrease in activity in San Diego based on this investment in personnel, technology, infrastructure. That was part of the brief. I had not heard what,
Okay.
directly.
Thank you. Ms. Grady, do you believe that it's going to stop the 99%, and do you know where the source of that information would be?
No, I do not know the source of the information. I believe it's probably, as Chief Vitello indicated, that the impact that we saw when we made the investments in San Diego, associated with what they saw in the positive impact of the combination of investments of resources and technology, infrastructure, and people.
Okay, so we're still not getting to 99%. Ms. Gambler, do you have any insight on this?
From the GAO perspective, we aren't familiar with the source of that data. I would just add, as I had mentioned in my oral remarks, we do have ongoing work looking at DHS's plans for the wall system, and we'll be reporting the results of that work later this year.
Thank you. You know, I've been a member of this committee for like 14 months, and it's amazing at how we hear from different people talk about a wall and what it would be effective for and what not. We see photos of tunnels going under walls. We see certainly contraptions being used to send drugs over a wall. And, you know, this is something where we're just dumping $18 billion without metrics. Does not seem like a good use of taxpayer dollars and making decisions without having the data. It's been a frightening pattern by this president who continuously makes false statements about border security and immigration to the American public to promote this central campaign promise on the wall. It's to the point where a senior ICE spokesman quit because of DHS intent on spreading false information about undocumented immigrants escaping arrest in Oakland. You know, more frightening is DHS's willingness to adopt the president's misguided views on border security and institutionalize them at a federal agency charged with defending and protecting our country when the facts show otherwise. Mr. Vitello, let me tell you, I represent the Port of Los Angeles, and I appreciate the work that your men and women do at the Port of Los Angeles. And they tell me, and we have been hearing from CBP that they need staffing, and I'm all for that. I am all for giving you the resources for the ports of entry, putting more money into where I believe there's a greater threat of national security and terrorism, which are the airports and the seaports. And so know that I will continue to advocate for more funding at our ports of entries, especially at our seaports, because I have seen firsthand the work that your men and women do. I appreciate that. I have a much bigger issue with the wall, as you probably can tell today. So thank you all for being here. And with that, my time has expired, and we have to run to votes. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. We're now going to go into recess. Unfortunately, this is a long vote series, so I apologize for our second panel. This may be close to an hour, but we will be back for the second panel. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today, and additional questions could be submitted for the record. We'll recess. All right, the subcommittee will come to order. We're pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses on this important topic. Mr. Brandon Judd is a Border Patrol agent and president of the National Border Patrol Council, representing more than 16,500 Border Patrol line agents. Brings with him nearly 20 years of experience as a Border Patrol agent. Mr. Judd is currently a Border Patrol agent assigned in Montana. Mr. Anthony Reardon is the national president of the National Treasury Employees Union. He is the leader of the largest independent federal sector union, representing 150,000 federal workers, including 25,000 CBP employees. Mr. Reardon has over 25 years of hands-on experience addressing the concerns of frontline employees. Thank you both for being here today. Appreciate your patience and your time. Chair now recognizes Mr. Judd for his testimony.
Chairwoman McSally, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. I'd like to begin by explaining how we got to where we are today and why legislation drafted by the subcommittee and priorities proposed by the Trump administration, including within Border Security Improvement Plan, are desperately needed by the men and women of the Border Patrol to make up for the mistakes of the past. In the mid-1980s, the United States faced its first major illegal immigration crisis. The Border Patrol had 4,000 agents who were charged with patrolling roughly 2,000 miles of our international border with Mexico. Other than barbed wire fences owned by ranchers, there were no vehicle or pedestrian barriers to impede illegal border crossers. The Border Patrol was overwhelmed, and Congress chose to deal with the influx of illegal aliens entering the U.S. by passing the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. The act promised to secure the border and ensure the United States was never put in the same situation again. While promises were made, promises were not kept, and simply put, the act failed. It failed in large part because the U.S. government put the cart before the horse. Without first securing the border, the federal government legalized several million persons who willfully violated U.S. law. By so doing, we broadcasted a clear message to the world that our laws could be made void if enough people enter the country illegally. The message was heard worldwide, and illegal immigration exploded. After the IRCA of 1986, illegal border crossings in high numbers took place almost exclusively in San Diego, California, and El Paso, Texas. The Border Patrol thought if it could control those two corridors, they would be able to control illegal immigration and narcotic smuggling. They threw the vast majority of their resources at these areas, but left other areas like the El Centro, California, the Yuma, Arizona, and the Tucson, Arizona Border Patrol sectors wide open. At the time, the prevailing thought was that the terrain and infrastructure and population density did not exist on either side of the border in these regions to allow smuggling organizations to move their operations to the inhospitable and barren desert areas of Arizona and California. The prevailing thought was wrong. For more than 10 years, the Tucson Border Patrol sector was overrun because we did not have the foresight to realize smuggling is big business and that the cartels are extremely flexible and adaptable. In essence, we created the problem in Tucson by securing only select portions of the border while leaving others to the east and west wide open. To this day, the citizens and ranchers of Arizona are still paying for our mistakes. Unlike today, in the 1980s and 90s, ISIS didn't exist, criminal cartels didn't control every facet of illegal activity on the border, and transnational gangs weren't prevalent in the U.S. Today, however, this is our reality. And if we refuse to learn from failed border security policies and operations of the past, we will never secure the border. We must take a proactive approach, and it must start with a proper mix of infrastructure, personnel, and technology, and it must be holistic. As an agent who has extensive experience working with and without border barriers, and as the person elected to represent rank-and-file Border Patrol agents nationwide, I can personally attest to how effective physical barriers are. A wall in strategic locations will ultimately lead to far greater effectiveness and allow us to direct our very limited manpower resources to areas without barriers and where illegal crossings are more likely to take place. I implore the subcommittee, as well as CBP, to follow through with these proposed investments and actually build walls in strategic locations. Regardless of the amount of funding being appropriated to CBP for tactical infrastructure or emerging technologies being deployed to the border, the fact remains that the most crucial asset to the Border Patrol is its agents. The men and women of the Border Patrol are some of the finest law enforcement professionals in the world, but unfortunately, we're losing agents faster than we can hire. I want to thank the subcommittee for your ongoing efforts to solve the personnel problems plaguing the Border Patrol, including the hiring of 5,000 additional agents. While new recruitment efforts are certainly necessary and crucial going forward, I am deeply concerned that CBP leadership is continuing to ignore our persistent agent retention problems and the detrimental impacts to budgeting, morale, and border security that stem from these sustained attrition rates. I am also concerned that the agency is once again putting the cart before the horse and spending hundreds of millions of dollars without addressing CBP's underlying personnel issues. We must fix our retention problems first. Then we can address recruitment issues once the Border Patrol stops hemorrhaging agents. I applaud both this subcommittee and the Trump administration for the comprehensive policies and initiatives that each have put forth. Going forward, it is crucial that we acknowledge that if we only build parts of the wall and try to simply shut down just the Rio Grande Valley, for example, without also addressing Laredo, Del Rio, and Big Bend, we will create the same types of holes in our defenses that we created in Arizona years ago. We cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. Again, I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Judd. Chair now recognizes Mr. Reardon for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Chairwoman McSally, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, thank you for the opportunity to again testify on behalf of over 25,000 frontline Customs and Border Protection officers, agriculture specialists, and trade enforcement specialists at CBP who are stationed at 328 U.S. air, sea, and land ports of entry and at pre-clearance operations overseas. As I told the subcommittee in January, the border security issues of utmost concern to CBP OFO employees are the hiring and funding challenges that contribute to ports of entry being chronically understaffed. In my testimony, I told you about excessive overtime requirements, temporary duty assignments to the southwest border ports, challenges to hiring, and the impact of staffing shortages on officer safety and morale. To address the concerns NTEU raised at the January hearing, Ranking Member Vela and others introduced a bill, H.R. 4940, the Border and Port Security Act, a bipartisan bill that would authorize the hiring of 500 additional CBP officers and other Office of Field Operations staff annually until the staffing gaps in CBP's various workload staffing models are met. NTEU strongly supports this standalone CBP officer staffing bill, and we urge every member of Congress to support this bill too. I'm here today to convey NTEU's concern with CBP's $33 billion proposal to fund critical CBP requirements to improve border security. There is no greater roadblock to border security, stopping illicit trafficking in people, drugs, illegal weapons, and money, and to ensuring legitimate trade and travel efficiency than the lack of sufficient staff at our ports. And the current CBP officer shortage is staggering. There is a vacancy rate of 1,145 funded CBP officers at the ports. And according to CBP, an additional 2,516 CBP officers need to be hired and funded in order to meet 2018 staffing needs. So as of today, there is a total CBP officer staffing shortage of 3,651. Unfortunately, I have learned that the $33 billion funding proposal to improve border security includes no appropriated funding to address the #1 security issue at the 328 U.S. ports of entry, and that is the current staffing shortage of approximately 3,600 positions. When discussing what do we get for $33 billion, the topic of this hearing, it is important to note the funding document sets forth $1.6 billion to fund 2,516 CBP officers. But the source of this funding appears to be an increase in the immigration and COBRA user fees and not a direct upfront appropriation from this $33 billion pot of money. These user fees cannot be increased without Congress enacting legislation. A proposal to increase user fees has been a part of the administration's budget submission since FY 2014 to fund the hiring of new CBP officers. And this user fee increase proposal is again in the FY 2019 budget request, even though the committees with jurisdiction have never shown any interest or even held a hearing to discuss this legislative proposal. I am reluctantly coming to the conclusion that there is no serious effort by Congress at this time to fund the hiring of critically needed CBP officers in the FY 2019 budget or the $33 billion border security funding proposal. The CBP officers and other employees I represent are frustrated that Congress does not seemingly recognize that securing the ports of entry is just as vital to border security as is securing the borders between the ports of entry, and the ports are an economic driver to the U.S. economy. It is imperative that Congress fund with appropriated dollars CBP officer new hires to alleviate the ongoing CBP staffing shortages at the ports of entry so that we realize real border security. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon. I ask unanimous consent that Ms. Jackson Lee have permission to sit and participate in this hearing. Without objection. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. First, Mr. Reardon, just more of a statement. I think you know that we're partners with you on these issues that you're talking about at the ports of entry. My first bill signed into law actually was fast-tracking our veterans for jobs at the ports of entry, and we're working through the polygraph bill as well. But just to let you know, I know you probably didn't have access to the underlying documents for the $33 billion, but I've got it right in front of me, and it does include resources for 2,516 CBP officers. That was the request from the White House in the $33 billion. Now, our bill, Secure America's Future Act, has 5,000 officers in there as well. So 5,000 Border Patrol and 5,000 CBP officers at the ports of entry. So, you know, those statements about what Congress is or isn't doing, we've been partnering with you. We know this is a critical issue, both between the ports of entry and at the ports of entry. And our legislation continues to support addressing these issues for the CBP officers there that are doing work day in and day out under pretty, I know, difficult conditions, especially I'm concerned in Arizona right now with the shortage. Mr. Judd, thanks for your perspective in the testimony where you talked about how policies of the past that were sort of piecemeal did a bit of a, you know, when you push on a balloon and it causes a reaction on the other end, right? Where in San Diego and El Paso sector, they did certain things to address those issues there, but it basically pushed the illegal activity into my state. And then when we did put up some barriers and other things in the urban areas, then it pushed the illegal activity out into the rural areas, where the ranchers and border residents have been dealing now for many, many years. The transnational criminal organizations trafficking through their property and through their communities, creating a very real threat and a lot of damage and all that goes with the illegal activity. So this is as a result of the failed policies of the past, as you brought up. You were there in Arizona. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how important it is that we don't just do this piecemeal thing or we push on one end or one sector, because we're basically going to create a problem in another community? And that is also a humanitarian issue. People are now, you know, trafficking through the hot desert in the summer and dying because of the way this has been done piecemeal in the past. So can you elaborate a little bit from your personal experience on how important that is?
Absolutely. If you look at Naco, specifically my old stomping grounds, where we had the infrastructure, we were able to control those specific small corridors. But what happened was we let go the outreaches, and the crossings there just shot up astronomically. I mean, in Naco, Arizona, I want to say it was in 2003, we arrested 112,000 illegal aliens. The entire Border Patrol, that's one station out of more than 150 stations in the entire Border Patrol. The entire Border Patrol last year had 400,000. Naco, one station in 1 year, had 112. And so what happened was these ranches were just completely and totally overrun, and these ranchers were overwhelmed. They could not maintain their livestock. They could not maintain their grazing fields due to the problems that they experienced. And so we just can't have them. The one thing that I am concerned about is our organization over the last 20 years has been the most politicized organization that I know of. Every single year we're talking about border security. Every single year we're debating border security. We can secure the border, and we can make this problem go away once and for all.
Mr. Judd, I do want to follow up. Given the $38 billion that we have in our legislation, which includes, again, holistically, the request from the administration plus port of entry issues, do you think that's going to be enough to give the tools and the resources that are needed to our agents to be able to secure the border?
I've seen the projections and I've seen what it is that we're looking for, and I believe that it does. It compensates. It in fact goes far enough to project into the future, which is something that we very rarely do. What was interesting is Congresswoman Bedegan asked Deputy Commissioner Vitello if he believed that the wall would be 99% effective. I can tell you that the U.S. Special Forces have tried out those barriers and they found that those barriers are impenetrable. I would say absolutely yes, those walls will be 99% effective, but we only need them in strategic locations. We're not talking about 2,000 miles of a continuous wall. We're talking strategic locations.
Great, thank you. And I mean, we heard from in our last hearing testimony, I think it was, where you do have physical barriers, or where you don't have physical barriers, it's maybe like 1 agent per mile. We were talking about a lot of metrics in the last panel, right? But where you do have physical barriers, again, combined with situational awareness and tools and sensors and agents, you could have more agents or less agents per mile. I think it was 1 agent per 3 miles. That's a pretty realistic or a pretty significant increase in the ability for them to be able to patrol and cover an area. So can you, just follow up on that, what that does for you if there's just a barrier they have to get over, combined with, again, the situational awareness that you need and the tools and the other agents?
Certainly. What it allows us to do is we have limited manpower. If we can stretch that manpower throughout the entire border, we can become more effective. Right now, at the McAllen Station, we have approximately 1,000 individuals that are in a processing center as we speak. Because we have so many individuals, we've had to take agents off of the line to put them in that processing center, which then leaves holes, huge gaps in the border. When we have walls, we're able to spread our manpower out a lot more, which allows us to be a lot more effective.
Great, thank you. I'm over my time. Chair, now recognize Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee from Texas.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you for your courtesies, and to my colleague, Mr. Vila, thank him for his service. Thank the chairman of the full committee, Mr. McCall, and the ranking member. I've been in Homeland Security hearings all day, and I am pleased to say so because the work that you do, Mr. Judd, and the work that all of your members do, Mr. Reardon, are to be truly complimented and appreciated. I've been on this committee long enough to hopefully know my sincerity on the enthusiasm I have with all of you who've been on the front lines of protecting this nation. So thank you again. Let me take a moment, although they are not from Texas, to acknowledge a bridge collapse in Florida International University, and there have been major loss of life. I say that because some of your members or colleagues will be on the front line dealing with that, and I think it's appropriate in this committee to take note of that. Madam Chair, I also want to put on the record that I hope, and I did not, forgive me, get a chance to do so, I will speak to him directly, but I wanted to put on the record, I think it is important for this committee to have a full briefing on Russia. I'll just put that on the classified briefing on Russia, and I hope that we can do that. I know next week is maybe difficult, but I hope that we'll be able to do that for the work that we do in this committee. Let me, again, Mr. Judd, very quickly, it's my time. I support, been on this committee long enough. I joined Senator Kerry some many years ago. I think you might remember, or you might have been a babe in arms when the Border Patrol agents did not have laptops, night goggles, vehicles, etc. And I think we put $400 million in a bill that ultimately passed to provide all of that equipment. So I know the work that you all do. I question a wall that we have no matrix, no established format to understand whether it will work or not. So let me just quickly ask you, on the Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge, there is already a Border Patrol presence, other law enforcement officers, and federal personnel and tourists. Given the people and resources already there, should building a wall in the refuge be a priority?
In certain locations, we don't need a wall. Again, we need it in strategic locations. I can't specifically speak to Santa Ana and until I see exactly that, but I do know that there are certain locations that we don't need a wall.
And that might likely be an area where you would not need a wall.
It very well could be.
Again, thank you for your service. Let me go to Mr. Reardon, because you mentioned the 3,651, and I shared a note with the chairwoman, but I just think I want to clarify it. Your point that you're making is there's no dedicated monies for these individuals who I view. I happen to spend a lot of time at the border only because I'm in Texas, and I know Henry Cuellar and Mr. Vila, so we're there a lot. But I've known every border, starting from California, and I think some of your friends who are sitting behind you know that I've been to every border, every detention center that I could possibly be in. So let me just focus and say, is that the point you're making? There's no dedicated dollars in this budget. What you're looking at is fees. And may I, in my question, so that you can take the time to answer your question, first of all, let me be very clear, $18 billion for a fence that was told to us by the administration that it was going to be paid for by the Mexican people and the Mexican government. We are documented by a report that was issued in September 2017 by DHS that we have the lowest number of illegal crossings in 40 years. But what you're speaking of that is very important is the need for officers, CBP, at these ports of entry where we have the shortest number, which really impacts any thought of illegal crossing. You can't get in legitimately, and it also stymies business. So would you comment on how you can do your business if you're dependent on fees? And I also believe, if you comment, $18 billion for a wall, I'd like to do increase in compensation and retention. That means we keep individuals who are who desire to have this as their profession. Would you please comment on how fees without dedicated funds impacts negatively on your workers, and how you don't have the workers that you really need because it's fees and it's at the busy port? Let me also say that I am a co-sponsor of Mr. Vila's H.R. 4940. I want to make sure that you know that. I'll yield to you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, and thank you for being a co-sponsor of that bill. Appreciate that very much. And Chairwoman McSally, I also want to make sure that you recognize that we at NTEU absolutely support the CBPO provision of hiring CBPOs. So that I hope you understand as well. And we're certainly also aware of the fact that the 2,600 CBPO number in the administration's proposal, we're aware of that, but my opening remarks, what I was referring to and included is that there's no actual direct funding, no appropriations for those folks, and this goes to the issue that Congresswoman Jackson Lee raised about the fees. The fact is that Congress has to approve those fees. And as I had suggested in my comments, right now, at least to this point, there's not even been hearings about that. And so what I'm concerned about is that, regardless of what Congress decides to do with regard to technology and border walls and all those things, we already are under siege at the ports of entry. And the fact is that we don't have about 3,600 people that we need at the ports of entry. And so as a result, and you've heard me say this before, but I'll add it again, that we have people who routinely, day after day, are working 16-hour days. That is not good for those individuals, it's not good for their families, and it most certainly is not beneficial to our protecting the homeland. So I think, from my perspective, if we're going to make a decision that border security and port security is important, and both are important, we've got to make sure that we have the necessary people to do the work in the ports of entry. And so we've got to fix the hiring problem. We've got to fix the polygraph problem. We've got to make sure that we're getting people in the door. And yes, I agree, we've got to make certain that we are also retaining those folks. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, my time is up, but let me just finish on this quick question. I thank the chairwoman for her indulgence. I know I'm flying out.
I know. Okay, I was going to do another round.
Yeah, let me just say that you're at the ports of entry, dominant population comes through at least legally or with some form of paperwork, and obviously some do not. But the point is you need fresh agents that can do their job to protect this nation. Do you think there should be focus on making sure they are a stable force and make sure that that happens as opposed to dollars that may have to be spent on a wall?
Well, I certainly think that regardless of where money is put, and I will certainly leave that to Congress to figure out, but what I do know is that we are making, I believe, a grave mistake in this country if we do not think that an integral part, a very important part of protecting our nation is ensuring that we have healthy and appropriate numbers of CBP officers. But let me also just add, I mean, I keep talking about, you know, the security of the country, but let's also remember that also part of the mission for these CBPOs is ensuring that appropriate trade and travel happens. There is a huge economic driver aspect of bringing these folks into the ports of entry as well. Now, I've not mentioned, I've been talking about CBPOs and 3,600 of them that we need, but we also have to remember that there are other aspects, other employees that are important to bring in. For example, agriculture specialists. The workforce staffing model, CBP's workforce staffing model, calls for an additional 700 plus of those folks. Now, these are the people that make sure that, you know, our crops don't get damaged when, you know, some bad kind of beetle comes in, for example, which has recently happened and has been caught by CBPOs, but also canine enforcement teams. There is a huge lack of canine enforcement teams in this country as well. So, I mean, there are a lot of folks out there that I mean, we just don't have enough of them.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. I do want to note before I go to Mr. Rutherford, the bill, the Secure America's Future Act, has 300 new canine teams and 631 agricultural inspectors. So we're with you. Mr. Rutherford from Florida, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both for being here this afternoon. And you know, it was mentioned earlier that at one time CBP didn't have laptops. They didn't, you know, they had a lot of equipment needs. And so as you brought in laptops, as you brought in technology, the efficiency of your officers has gone up. They're able to do more. One of the things that I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about, you know, building an $18 billion wall, along with the technology, along with the access, which is, as you all know, is huge. As we do that, as we add the wall, as we add the technology, as we add the access to those very remote areas, that will assist CBP in accomplishing the mission with fewer officers, actually, and then they'd be able to move those officers to other areas as well. So there are some good savings that could actually be built into you know, a wall and utilizing technology properly. I mean, every law enforcement agency in the country has used technology to enhance their performance. And so, I think you all will not only will do the same thing, you have done the same thing. And I'd like to, Mr. Reardon, for just a moment, and you touched on it briefly about the economic impact of it, but this, you know, in your comments, there's the 328 land, sea, and airports across the country. I'm really worried about points of departure abroad. Those 16 locations, I know as a chairwoman and some of the other members, we sat in some of these security briefings, hearing about some of the things that are out there. I worry about those points of departure where it's coming our way, and you guys are integral to making sure that that process is safe as well. Can you talk a little bit about your needs over there?
Well, certainly we have pre-clearance sites around the world, and they are staffed by CBPOs, and clearly the idea is to check folks there and to make certain that no bad actors are going to be coming into our country, to be able to stop them, you know, at locations
Right.
overseas or in Canada, for example. The reality is that regardless of whether or not you have additional pre-clearance sites, and there's certainly on the drawing board additional pre-clearance sites that they're looking at opening and beginning to staff, you still need more people. And as you're taking more of those folks overseas somewhere, you're drawing, you know, unless you're really increasing the workforce
From the limited
here,
number here.
exactly, you're drawing from the folks that we have here. So it only really exacerbates the problem, candidly. And I certainly think it's important to make sure that we have these pre-clearance sites and that we appropriately staff them. But we can't do it without also taking care of what we do at the ports here.
And I believe as we continue to tighten up our land border, that more and more, particularly our southern land border, more and more we're going to see our ports where we're bringing in, you know, I represent the Port of Jacksonville, as you know, and, you know, we're bringing in tens of thousands of containers every day. And I want to make sure that you have the resources that you need at that location, because I really see these ports as kind of the Trojan horse dealing with our security. We're bringing that stuff in just like they brought in, you know, the people of Troy brought that horse right into their own city, and we know the rest of the story. I want to make sure that that's not happening in the Port of Jacksonville and other ports around the country. So the numbers are incredibly important, I think, but so is the technology, and I want to make sure that we have, because some of the things that I'm hearing is our technology is not keeping pace at some of these seaports of entry as well. Is that your concern as well?
Well, I will tell you that I'm certainly an advocate of our using technology. And, you know, in some of the locations where we receive a lot of mail, for example, they're using technology to a really excellent degree to check on some of the drugs that are being sent in, and it's really helping our officers. Unfortunately, for example, in Memphis, Tennessee, we don't have enough of the officers to actually fully utilize all of the equipment that's there.
Yes, sir.
So that's important. But I also want to make one other point. You know, as we do all of these things, whether, like I said, whether it's a wall, whether it's you know, certain other types of technology to strengthen the borders, guess what's going to happen? It's going to force the bad actors to try to get through the ports.
Elsewhere, right.
Right. And so I think, you know, I mean, I think I heard somebody earlier say, you know, we have to have kind of a holistic approach. And my concern is that we're going to pay a lot of attention to the borders, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't. What I am suggesting, though, is that we have to do much, much better than we're currently doing in our ports of entry.
Thank you, and that's my concern as well, and I see my time's up. Thank you.
Thank
I
you,
yield
Mr.
back,
Rutherford.
Madam.
I'm going to do a second round here if you feel like sticking around, but if not, there's a lot of things to talk about here, and I appreciate the witnesses. A lot of discussion today on both panels about manning issues and retention issues in particular. I think it's so crucial. We invest the now speedy 10 months into hiring somebody. It used to be a lot longer than that. We invest in the training. We provide and they gain tremendous experience at the ports and between the ports, out there, doing the hard work every single day. But because of many of the conditions that have been described, and the lack of manning and lack of resources and the lack of incentive pay and the remote locations and the overtime and all that, because of all that, we're losing people. And we're losing people faster than we're replacing them. And this is significant focus of mine that I'm really concerned about. It's going to take. How long does it take to replace a 10-year agent, right? It takes 10 years, and it takes a whole lot of money and resources. So as we obviously need a pipeline coming in, we've got to make sure that we stop the bleeding. And we've heard some of your perspectives and ideas on that. But our bill, again, includes the appropriate authorities and resources as a part of this trust fund so that we can provide some incentives to those that are in remote areas that are difficult for them to move there, but then maybe they get a good follow-on assignment, those types of things like in the military. What else is it going to take, Mr. Judd, for us to retain these amazing men and women in the green suit, and then Mr. Reardon, those blue suiters out there? What else can we do?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is it's always respectable when when you're working with legislators that have actually been there and done it. You've gone to the border. You've actually patrolled the border without the pomp and ceremony. You didn't notify the agency. You've actually gone to the ports of entry without the pomp and ceremony. You've seen the things that we face. You've seen the gaps that there are in border security. There are a lot of things that we have to look at that we can do, but one of the things that we have to consider is we have to consider the pay parities within the different agencies. Border Patrol agents are just like anybody else. They want to earn more money for standard of living, and if they can earn more money somewhere else, they're going to go to those locations. I sat down with Acting Commissioner McEleenan in January of 2017. He asked me to come sit down with him to talk about some of the things that we could do to retain our employees. January of 2017, I presented a great many ideas, most of which he agreed with and liked, yet we're more than a year later and we haven't implemented even one of those ideas. And so we have to look at that and we have to say, I can't put all the pressure on you. We know that legislation takes a long time. There are things that we can do administratively, and that's where we're looking to you for oversight. If we can get some oversight, we can get these programs implemented administratively so that we can keep our people.
Great. Can you give us a list of those things that you asked them for, and
I'll
we
be
can
happy to do that.
start ask them how those things are moving through the administrative processes.
I will
We
do
look
that.
forward to that. And Mr. Reardon.
Thank you. First off, I would thank you for all the work that you've done on the retention issues, such as incentives. I think something else that can be done is look at student loan repayments. That I believe would probably be pretty good. And the final thing that I would offer is when we're looking at trying to staff and also retain these organizations, and really this holds true across agencies. The notion that we would have a pay freeze when the private sector is looking at 3% increases, it's pretty hard, I think, to encourage somebody to not only come to work here, but to stay when they have to always worry about whether or not they're going to get a pay increase, even a cost of living increase. So that's the final thing I would offer.
Okay, great. I do have some more questions, but I'm gonna give it to the gentleman from Florida if he'd like another round, and then I'll circle back again one more time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Along those lines, Mr. Reardon, my agency, many years ago, we implemented a pay scale based on seniority, and you automatically move through that. So it was kind of a built-in way to keep salaries competitive. And so I would love to see, Mr. Judd, I'd love to see that copy of that list as well, so that we can help move some of these things forward. Because I think it's not just pay, it's benefits and other issues that I think we all need to be looking at, because these men and women are asked to really do some tough things, and we need to recognize that. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Okay, final round. We've spent a lot of time today talking about physical barriers and the border wall and the border wall system. And look, I come from serving in the military, and I want to look at what's effective and how we can actually get the mission done. And I'll tell you, now that I've been in this political sphere for a few years, sometimes it blows my mind how things get taken out of proportion and turned into something political. I mean, you look at the Secure Fence Act, which was voted on by then Senator Obama. then Senator Clinton, then Senator Schumer, all realizing the value of putting physical barriers at 700 miles on our southern border in order to stop and slow down the illegal activity and the cartel activity that's coming into our country. At the time, that seemed fine. Even President Obama. I mean, I was down in Naco over the summer, seeing where some replacement barriers were being put in, and because of the environment that we're in, people are like, oh no, that's President Trump's wall, and my answer was, no, that's Obama's wall. Right? Because that was approved by President Barack Obama. And, you know, I have a little list here. In Nogales, 2.8 miles. In Douglas, 9.5 miles. In Naco, 7 miles. This is all signed and approved funding by President Barack Obama. San Luis, 1.8 miles. And Anapra, 1.3 miles. Physical barriers have not been contentious in the past. But now, because we have a president who understands that we can't just piecemeal it, like you said, Mr. Judd. We can't just piecemeal it because they'll go around it and they'll move to other communities. But we need a holistic approach that includes a border wall system. That previously was not contentious. But because of the environment that we're in, and there is this massive resistance to literally everything he does, everybody's against that too. They're against the things that they were previously for. I don't get it. For communities like mine, some of what the Secure Fence Act included was Normandy barriers, which are very short, a couple feet high, intended for vehicles, but you can walk right over them. The drug, mules can walk right over them, as you know. They put ramps up and they'll drive right over them. Those need to be replaced by something that's a little bit more like what has been, tested in some of these prototypes in San Diego. This should be a no-brainer. So I just want to, again, hear from you, Mr. Judd. Let's just get out of the politics and into the reality of what our agents need and what a actually workable border wall system will do for them and why it's so important to stop playing politics with this issue so that we can actually keep our community safe.
We've already proven what they do. I put on a uniform almost every day. I go out to the actual border. I patrol the border almost every day. And what I can tell you is that in the locations that you're talking about, in Douglas, in Naco, we saw what it was like when we did not have any physical barriers. And we saw immediately the drop in the number of illegal crossings that happened. Again, 2003, 112,000 apprehensions. Last year in Naco, I think that the apprehensions were somewhere around 20,000. So from 112 to 20,000, and that is largely due to the technology that we invested, which includes barriers. There's a lot of things that we can do that actually don't cost money. And Mr. Rutherford, Congressman Rutherford, the things that I suggested to Acting Commissioner McElhaney don't cost a dime. There's a lot of things that we can do. Don't mean to take your time, but after my sophomore year of college, I worked in Phoenix doing concrete for Temcon Concrete. I can tell you that I was only getting paid $7.50 an hour. But when I left the work site, I was able to look back and see what I accomplished, and it felt good. And our agents want to feel good about what they do. They want to feel good about their job. And when they feel like they're doing something that means something, they're going to stick with that job as well. So just one thing to think about.
Thank you. Have they been asking line agents input in the prototype process here for the system?
We have been able to add some input, yes.
Oh, that's great. So do you have any idea, have you heard what the timeline is for any of that feedback to be given back to all of you and all of us?
No, but one of the things that President Trump said in California that I appreciated was that he said that we need to be able to see through those fencing to see the threats that are coming up. Otherwise, you don't know what's taking place on the other side of the wall. That is something that we have been advocating for forever, and President Trump listened. He's actually listening to the experts that are on the border every day, and he's implementing those, what we're recommending to him, and it's allowing us to be a lot more effective on the border.
Great, thank you. And last question, Mr. Judd. I in my opening statement, I talked about these loopholes, these policy loopholes, and many people may not understand what I'm talking about, but even if we were to perfectly secure our border, with everything that you all need in order to make that happen, because of these policy loopholes, we have individuals that are seeking out the Border Patrol. They are looking for them. They are not evading them in order to find you and to turn themselves into you. And the cartels have trained them to say exactly what they need to say in order to then be released into the interior of the United States with a hearing for a likely false asylum claim, for example, years in the future because of the backlog, never to be seen again. So like as we speak, this is happening every single day. So even if we were to do all this on border security, it's so important for us to appropriately close these loopholes while we still ensure that those with legitimate asylum claims get their day in court, which are being lost in the shuffle of all these false ones, plus the unaccompanied minor policy that is bogging down the system. So can you just share and make sure that, I want to make sure that America can hear from you as to what these loopholes are doing and why they need to be closed?
We call it the catch and release policy. What happens is individuals will cross the border knowing that all they have to do is come up to me and say, "Here I am, arrest me," and I take them back to the processing centers to process them, and they say, "Well, I'm scared to go back to my country." We then transfer them to ICE ERO, and ICE ERO releases them. What that does is that's a magnet that draws people to cross our borders illegally. Now, what's interesting about that is they could actually do this legally. They could actually go to the ports of entry and claim asylum, and that's legal, but they're crossing the border illegally. Now, they're doing that because the smugglers know that if they overwhelm us with what we call these give-ups, if they overwhelm us with these give-ups, it takes our resources out of the field, creating holes in the border, which then allows them to cross the more dangerous things that come across our border, and it completely and totally bogs down the system and floods the system. So this catch and release program, this policy that allows us to release people into the United States, which they then go and disappear into the shadows, it completely and totally destroys any semblance of border security, and it has to stop.
And Mr. Reardon, the same thing's happening at the ports of entry. They're turning themselves in, right? And so these agents who are supposed to be working on the flow of legitimate commerce and really looking for the bad stuff coming through are now being bogged down by basically people taking advantage of the system. Have you heard feedback from your members on this?
I've heard some feedback on it. Not, I'm sure, as much as Mr. Judd experiences it, but I have heard something to that effect.
Great, I appreciate it. Well, I appreciate everybody's time. Do you have any more questions? Okay, well, thanks for your patience. I'm supposed to say something at the end here about the hearing is going to stay open for a few days, so hang on here. All right, right there. No, there it is. All right, I want to thank the witnesses, of course, for your valuable testimony. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.